Thank you very much. Thank you, Akshay. Sorry, I'm starting badly with a little bit of a sore throat. So, the way I'm going to proceed is on the assumption that the United States of America, which is the largest economy in the world at more than $16 trillion, has actually begun to grow again. Since the financial collapse of 2008, the USA went through a quite troubled period of economic slowdown. It had quarters when it went into recession, but now it has started to grow again, and it is growing quite strongly at about 3% per annum. The rate of unemployment, which had also gone up to more than 9%, has actually declined now to around 6%. So the assumption is that the United States of America is actually growing quite strongly. What we are going to try and understand is what's happening to China. Is China also growing strongly? Is its growth now threatening? And is it threatened so much that it will not have an important role in the world any longer? And this is important because China is already the second largest economy in the world at roughly $10 trillion a year. So about 2/3 the size of the American economy. But in last year, China actually overtook the American economy in purchasing power parity terms, not yet in nominal dollar terms, but it is slated to become the largest economy in the world by some estimates by next year, by the end of 2016. It will overtake the United States of America even in dollar terms. And the reason for that is because China is growing at the rate of 7.5% last year, whereas the United States, which has actually improved, is growing at just about 3%. Now, even though the United States is a much larger economy, its rate of growth is much slower. So while the US adds just $50 billion in its extra rate of growth, every year the Chinese economy, which is growing at more than twice the rate of the economy of the American economy, is adding 75 billion. The other aspects which are very important is of course that both of these economies are very interdependent. They have trade worth about $500 billion every year, which means both that the Chinese economy depends upon the American economy, which in turn depends upon the Chinese economy in order to grow together. In a way, what we are saying is that they will either grow or sink together as well. If there is trouble in one economy, it makes trouble for the other economy as well. Now, in many ways, the US is more dependent on China for its growth because every year it has a huge trade deficit of almost $280 billion in 1 year. Now, what this means is that the Chinese economy actually produces much more of what the Americans want to buy from it than the American economy produces of things that the Chinese want to buy. So, in that sense, the dependence of the United States on China is much greater than the other. Moreover, because this trade deficit has gone on for decades, the situation now is that China has foreign exchange reserves worth $4 trillion as compared to the United States, which is a highly indebted economy. If to this $4 trillion you add also the $328 billion in foreign exchange reserves held by Hong Kong, we're really talking about $4.5 trillion. From these huge, massive foreign exchange reserves, and just by comparison, I will tell you that India has foreign exchange reserves of about $320 billion, which we think is a comfortable figure. But you look at that and then you look at China, $4.5 trillion. Of that, China holds $1.2 trillion in United States Treasury bills. That is how much money the United States of America has borrowed from China to keep its current budgets in balance. We have to also remember that the Chinese economy, which 40 years ago when it started growing was roughly the same size as the Indian economy, about $390 billion. It has grown at the rate of almost 9% for 30 years. And in between, for 2 or 3 years, it grew at the rate of 14%, which means that every 5 years it was doubling in size. Now, an economy which has such a high rate of growth sustained over such a long period, it has a lot of gravitas, it has a lot which will keep it growing strongly for quite a long time. Also, among its strengths is the fact that it has a savings rate of almost 50%. So, half of what is produced is actually saved. Investment is also about 50%. So, it has been able to grow its asset base. It has great infrastructure, it has a lot of real estate, it has factories, it has roads, it has now among the largest rail networks in the world. So all of these are real assets. But even if there is some problem for a year or so, it still is an economy with a solid asset base. Is this economy going to slow down in this economy which has begun? It is clear to everybody that the Chinese economy has now slowed down. Last year it grew at a rate of 7.8%. The year before. Last year it grew at 7.4%. And this year it is expected to lose at least another 0.5%. So its rate of growth will fall below 7%. Now, does that look as if it is already about 0.5% a year it is losing, or does that look like it is disorderly? It looks to me quite orderly. The government has decided, it has announced 2 years ago, a policy that they will gradually slow the rate of growth. And for the last 2 years, they have slowed it by about 0.5% each year. Now we will see. Of course, they say that it's very difficult to make predictions about, and especially about the future. But this trend would show that it is quite steady. I think there is another of the policy decisions taken is to try to shift the economy from very focused on investment and export-led growth to a consumption economy. So they are hoping that there will be more of the resources, less savings and more income spent on consumption. And last year, the consumption grew by 10.7%. It is also true that investment grew by 7.7%, but the rate of growth of consumption has started to pick up. In the shift that is taking place, it is important for the government to keep investment reasonably high because they need to sustain high levels of employment. They cannot shift out of investment completely because otherwise no new jobs will be created. And that has its own implications in terms of unrest in society and all the difficulties that go with that. Moreover, the shift in the Chinese economy is from consumption of goods to services. Now, production of services, as all of you know, is much more labor intensive. So that also helps to sustain a high level of employment. They also decided, the government also decided that it would allow an increasing play for market forces to reduce the share of state-owned companies in the total product. To some extent, this has also begun to take effect, but perhaps not as much as the government would have liked to see. Then I will now mention just a couple of other issues so that you understand how China is politically a very stable country. It has had 5 transitions of power. Every new government that comes stays for about 10 years, and they have for the last 50 years had peaceful transitions of power. The bargain that seems to have been made by the Communist Party of China with the people is that they will have growth, they will have employment, but they will not have the kind of freedoms that the democracy brings, except at some time into the future. And finally, I just want to mention, all of you know how the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi has had this enormous victory, 67 out of 70 seats, on the one issue that it is an anti-corruption party. China today is conducting an anti-corruption campaign so vast that in the last 2 years, almost 200,000 officials have been investigated. Those that were found guilty have been punished, and there have been some very public trials. So the anti-corruption campaign that the government is carrying out is also giving stability to the government because it is improving its functioning and it's a very popular campaign. Thank you.
Greetings, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity. The full import of the statement, child is the father of man, I learned a couple of months ago when my daughter, 9-year-old daughter, was sitting with her friends and blowing balloons. It took them a long while to figure out if they try to blow the balloon bigger and bigger, the chances of it bursting are more and more. Physics explains this in a very evolved way that it takes a certain amount of size for a balloon to burst. A balloon does not burst when it's small, it bursts when it's large. The second thing I want to talk about is Japan. None of you were even thought of, let alone be born, most of you from the audience. But Neelam and I go back to the vintage. In the 70s and 80s, the in thing was Japan. There was not an economist in the world, there was not a political commentator in the world who had not predicted that Japan will overtake the United States of America. The index has fallen roughly 60%. For a large part of it, it languished between 8 and 10,000, which is a loss of about 75%. What changed in Japan? An economy was driven by exports. An economy with very little local consumption. Sounds familiar? The US, with its muscle power, got enough countries around the world to lobby against Japan for its exchange rate. So the Japanese yen, which was trading at about 360 yen to a single dollar, gained almost 75 to a dollar, which means its export competitiveness fell by about 75%. Without a domestic economy to hold its own, the bubble burst in 1989. And what fueled it through the 25-year period was the Japanese savings at below market rates that the banks paid them. It is often said that history repeats itself, but if it doesn't repeat, it certainly rivals. Why am I telling you so much about Japan when the topic is China? The parallels are far too strong. It is an economy which has had a tremendous bull run from 1982 on the back of a famous comment on to hell with ideologies. I don't care whether the cat is black or white so long as it catches mice. And that clarion call led to a 30-year stupendous growth rate in the Chinese economy from 1982 to 2012, a 30-year average of 10.2%. So it did better than Japan. It beat the 25-year mark to 30-year mark. It beat Japan from an 8.5% growth over 30 years to China's over 10.2%. And every state has beaten every record. But where is China struggling today? Why is my daughter's balloon becoming big? China has funded a lot of its growth from savings. The savings rate is comparable at almost a 50%. And those savers are paid below market rates. And they continue to be paid below market rates to provide for cheap financing through the state, through the provinces, through the public sector corporations, through the shadow banks, to various enterprises. And where has, in the absence of consumption, where has bulk of this money gone into investment? If China were a company and not a country, investment in capital items will not feature in the revenue account or the profit and loss account. It will feature in the balance sheet and will not be counted for growth. But China is not a corporation, it is a country. So, what has funneled its growth over the years, as Neelam was referring to, is state-of-the-art infrastructure. It is a solution seeking a problem. In turn, has become a problem by itself. So, you today have a dip in manufacturing of an order that it has not seen. In 2010, manufacturing, which she rightly pointed out, is the engine for the workforce, is the engine for employment. That manufacturing growth, which was at 14.5% in 2010, is now south of 8% and trending down. The balloon is getting bigger. They have built infrastructure, roads to nowhere, half-occupied buildings, ghost towns, to the extent that the real estate boom, or the artificial boom in the real estate, the entire country got shocked because a large part of it was financed through the state-owned banks and the shadow banking system. So, about a couple of years ago, the Chinese government, and as you rightly said, it's a very stable economy because one person decides. Democracy is not the order of the day. So, one person decided that they will stop lending to real estate and stop the speculation. When they stopped lending to real estate and stopped the speculation, demand fell, and that demand was not for self-owned, but for investment, speculative demand. Demand fell. Construction, which is the biggest block of the Chinese economy, which is the dominant force of the Chinese economy, fell into troubled waters. So again, the stable economy, stable politics that Neelam spoke about, allow them to say, hey, sorry, we made a mistake, now let's go back and pump this. So today you have real estate bubble again. And here again there is no parallel to Japan. In the 80s, one of the things that the Japanese indulged in was buying real estate in America. You know that the Rockefeller Plaza was sold by the Rockefeller family to the Japanese investors for a small sum of $1.5 billion. And why did they price it so high? Because in Japan, property prices were ranging at about 100 times the profit per annum of that building. Whereas in the United States, it was trading at 17 times. And they thought the United States property was cheap. So they went and bought the Rockefeller Plaza for $1.5 billion. And they sold it in 5 years later at a loss of $600 million loss. History is repeating itself. The largest buyer of US property today are the Chinese. So you have a scenario where there are enough telltale signs of a country having grown pretty fast, and hats off to them. Over a 30-year period, if somebody can grow at 10.2%, hats off to them. They have lifted a lot of people out of poverty, but do not have either of the two pillars, which is either the demography to support them or the democracy to ensure systemic check. Demographic is working against China. The population is aging because some time ago they had a one-child rule policy. Again, stable politics ensured that. So they had a one-child rule policy, which today has a very aging population. And because they don't have democracy, they don't have the institutional framework to provide the check and balance on the government. So it's a kind of a victory that she spoke about of an our party in India would be unthinkable in a place like China to have that kind of check and balance in the system. Now, in that kind of a scenario, to me it will surprise that this bubble can go further. I will just end with a study of a famed professor from the most famous Harvard University, Larry Summers and Mark Pritchett. They said if economies grow at a very fast pace for an extended period of time, they will quickly return to the global average. The global average of growth is between around 3%. So if somebody has grown for 30 years at 10.2%, I'm sure all of you are very good in high school arithmetic to know what the correction factor should be. I rest my case that the probability of a disorderly correction there is quite high, and I remain quiet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neelam. I saw you take copious notes, so if you disagree.
Of course, I disagree. I disagree for two or three reasons, which I'm going to set out very quickly. One is, of course, that Larry Summers is from Harvard, and he's a very famous man. He was also the Secretary of Finance of the Treasury in the United States of America. And soon after that, the economy started to tank. The rate of growth started to go down. He's also famously a racist. He had proposed when he was in the World Bank that radioactive material from nuclear power plants in the developed countries can actually just be left in Africa. So what do Africans matter? What do they come for? So we will take his opinion on the prospects of growth for non-Caucasian countries with a big pinch of salt and no radioactive material. So secondly, I would like to point out and remind Vaidyanathan, who is absolutely right in what he analyzed about Japan. But Japan today is still the third largest economy in the world. It only stopped being the second largest economy in the world about 4 years ago when it was overtaken by China. It still has, Japanese companies still have $1 trillion in investments abroad. It's a very stable economy. It may not be growing rapidly, but neither in the United States of America, neither in any of the European countries. Germany has been growing at less than 1%, and it is the best record in Europe. I mean, you look at the Italian economy, it is shrinking by about 5-7% every year. So, if Japan manages to grow a little bit, it's doing very well. Its people are extremely well. And it became the second largest economy in the world with half the population of the United States of America. So actually the people, the workers were twice as productive as in the US economy. Thirdly, China will already be the largest economy in the world before it begins to slow down sharply and come to the low levels that the American economy has enjoyed for the last 5 years. Since it will be the biggest economy, it cannot be subjected to the kind of currency blackmail that Japan was subjected to by the Americans, where they forced up the value of the yen. China has been smart. They have started to create alternate financial institutions like the Asian Investment Bank. They are part of the BRICS Bank, and they have entered into a lot of currency swap deals with, and India would like to be part of those currency swap deals as well. So it will not be as dependent on the dollar foreign exchange rate, which anyway gives an unfair advantage to the US economy. And finally, I think that remember that the US economy also has many weaknesses. Right now, the President of the United States of America and its Parliament, the US Congress, are not on talking terms. They will do nothing together. They will not pass legislation, regardless of how important or how critical that legislation is. The infrastructure of the United States of America is crumbling, and it is President Obama himself who says that every year in his State of the Union address. The savings rate of the United States, which used to be below zero, they were spending more than they actually income that they generated, but it has stabilized a little bit to the credit of the ordinary American citizen. The United States also has serious social problems. There are issues there. Just as correctly, I think Benny has pointed out that demography is going to be a problem in China. It did become a problem in Japan. But the United States has serious issues of racism, and as the immigrant population, as the Hispanic population percentages increase in the United States, they are already worried about the fact that by 2050, the immigrant population, the non-white population of the US will be more than 50% of the population. So this is a people that also need to come to terms with what is happening in their societies. Thank you.
You watch a lot of television, expression that is often thrown at you. Don't shoot the message. That is something that is clearly a message. There is deep research that has gone into a lot of it. I want to remind Neelam that the subject of discussion is not merits and demerits of America. We can have separate discussion and possibly sit on the same side as her on issues around the United States of America. And I do want to point a few things that I worry about. You have to remember that the United States deals from a position of strength because its home currency is the currency of the world, and that gives it disproportionate power in world matters. I'll give you an example. In the late 90s, a lot of the Asian countries went into difficulty, and they were all doing exceptionally well in exports. They earned a lot of dollars, but they put those dollars into real estate. They gave it to the rulers of similar stable governments like China. The rulers gave it to their uncles and cousins and third nephews, who went, all of which went to real estate. So when that bubble burst, these countries, Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, tanked like 50-60%. Disorder. In fact, the joke in Malaysia in 1988 is the eighth wonder of the world is a moving crane. So when things go bad, they go really bad. And America influenced IMF to tell all these countries that if you have excess dollars, your country is not safe, keep it with me. And that resulted in a big boom in America. And China, coming after this for the party, started earning dollars. So when she talks about China's strength of $4 trillion reserves, $2 trillion of which is in the United States, 1.2 of which is in US government bills. It's a very simple story. If I lend you 100 rupees, It's your problem. If I lend you 1 crore of rupees, it's my problem. So they have shifted, the earth is on the other foot. They have managed to carefully shift, and my day job is risk management. And this is what I say, how do you transfer risk? So the United States can print its currency and have all these surpluses of different countries in its currency, to enjoy the ride, but the risk is on the other foot. The third point I want to say is the numbers coming out of China. In a country like India, if a defense minister said something a month ago and somebody else said something the next day, then Arnab Goswami and company lampooned him on television for the next 10 days till they get a new subject. In China, numbers don't happen. The economy is supposed to be registering about a 7% growth this year. Its construction industry, which is the backbone, is 0. Housing is negative. Automobile is at half its usual number at 3%. These are the big giants that make up the economy. Where does it all add up to the 7%? So I worry about the quality of data coming out and the level of scrutiny that the data is put in. So the simple point I want to close with is, I'm not a fan of the United States, but I recognize its godfather status. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Sarkar. Towards the end of the movie, Abhishek Bachchan puts his hand out to the Swamiji and says, you have two choices. You can shake my hand or shake the hand of God. With America, it's one and the same, and that's how they deal. So it is important to remember that the roller coaster rides of kind of stunning growth always come to a bad end at the end of the market. And that is what I'm worrying about, and that's my fear. That's why I think that this ought to be a very high probability. Thank you.